think of as Calvinism, is a concept called the perseverance of the saints. Sometimes um, people prefer to call it the preservation of the saints, emphasizing that the reason that the saints persevere is because God is preserving. This is one of the so-called 5 points of Calvinism, and the doctrine that is, I think, unhappily reduced by modern evangelicals to a phrase, once saved, always saved. Um, it kind of loses the aspect of our engagement in the process. We are not robots. And yes, it is by his grace that we persevere, but we do persevere. I mean, there are some people in modern expressions of Calvinism that almost you'd almost think that nobody even has to, you know, choose to follow Christ. It's as if everything just happens magically and in sort of a distant way. But be that as it may, perseverance was an important doctrine for people like Puritans of New England and of Old England, um, as they search and grasp for the assurance of their election. In other words, wherever it was preached that God had elected some to salvation, people were keen to discover, am I one of the elect? And so those people believed in hell as an absolute reality. They lived in a world where the line between life and death was razor thin. People died in shipwrecks. People died in accidents. They died in smallpox epidemics. There was not modern medicine as we have now. Um, there were no inoculations going back in time. And so, in a world where life was very uncertain, they longed for something to hold on to. And they found it to some extent in the stock of perseverance. Heidelberg Seminary frames the concept of perseverance and then gives a proof text for it in these words: hope is inseparably connected with true faith. It is God's guarantee that what we have believed will be fulfilled by God. And then they quote this verse: for we're saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, then we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. And so you can see here that for the Reformed Christian, hope is very closely tied to faith. I would quote Hebrews 11:1 if I were trying to make this point. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, conviction of things not seen. And the logic there is that faith creates a kind of hope that's different from what we sometimes think of as hope. Did you pass the test? Well, I hope so. That kind of hope has often no basis in reality. You didn't study, you didn't understand the material that you're hoping somehow that you still pass the test. Well, Christian faith is not like that. It is intimately connected with believing that what God promised he will do. And so we have hope in the promises of God because of our belief in God, because of our faith in God. Now, the better known passages on perseverance, though, uh, might almost be used to argue against uh, what we think of as the Calvinistic doctrine of perseverance of the faith. There are two passages particularly found in Matthew, and these verses are deliberate markers just before the disciples are kind of assembled. First time in Matthew that you hear the names of all of the apostles mentioned. Jesus gathers them for kind of a fireside chat, and he tells them what to expect as they launch into their ministry in the land of Israel. And then he again makes one of these statements later in the Bible, just before he's going to launch them into their international ministry, where they will go not just to the tribes of Israel, but now to the nations as well. And so let's look at those two passages quickly. In Matthew 10, Jesus has gathered his 12 disciples and he's lecturing them on the less pleasant aspects that their work is going to incorporate. And here it is. They are going to be treated as he was treated. And he is going to be treated like a devil. This is not an easy assignment, but Jesus explains it will be worth the cost. And he explains it in these words. Matthew 10:22, you will be hated by everyone because of my name, but the one who persevered or endures to the end will be saved. So there it is described sort of from the point of view of the human endeavor. We've been given this assignment from God, and it's not going to be easy. It's going to involve persecution, but those who persevere to the end will be saved. Now we know that behind that perseverance is what we talked about earlier. There is that faith that creates a hope that God will do what he has said. But here you see it's presented in terms of the results. And those who persevere to the end are the ones who will be saved. And this is where the doctrine of kind of once saved, always saved, as it's commonly portrayed, which is, here's someone that, said the right words in a gospel rally 40 years ago and has lived for the devil ever since. And he thinks he's going to heaven. And a verse like this says, well, your life does not look like the life of those who persevere. And so maybe you better check yourself out again. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Well, finally, then in Matthew 24, Jesus explains the future ministry of the disciples, their global ministry, their ministry in the last days. And he frames it in similar terms as those he's used to describe their earlier ministry to the folk of Israel. Matthew 24, verses 12 through 13. Then, we're talking about the last days here, and we're in the last days. They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Verse 13, but the one who persevered or endured to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, this word persevere is often translated endure, and it means to remain behind, to stand one's ground, right? So those who remain behind will be saved. Those who stand their ground will be saved. Those who show endurance will be saved. Those who bear up against this persecution will be saved. Those who persevere to the end will be saved. And so you see here that perseverance is an action. It is a deliberate choice. It's an engagement. It is not, as some people may think, a kind of sleepwalk, where you're just in automatic pilot and you're like a car that's being towed by a tow truck, and that's your Christian life. No, you are engaged in this act of persevering. And yes, it is through faith. And yes, it is faith that creates hope, hope that the promises of Jesus will be fulfilled. And it is because what is ahead is so much more, valuable than anything else. It's because what lies ahead is the pearl of great price, if you will. It's because of that you're willing to endure anything and everything, even death, if it's required. Now, the writer of Hebrews, we read this earlier, describes the path of discipleship as a race and pictures us running the last leg before the cheering crowd, not of the Colosseum, but of heaven itself. And there, our entrance into glory is pictured as a runner crossing the finish line as the crowd watches. Therefore, says the apostle, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Verse 3, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Now, if you're looking at this, and I hope you're not, but I hope you'll look at it later, you'll see that this word endurance comes up in verse 1, in verse 2, and in verse 3. Let us run with endurance. Look to Jesus, who endured the cross. Consider Jesus, who endured the hostility of sinners, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. And so in this little passage from Hebrews, first we consider the saints of the heavenly congregation, the martyrs who have passed from the church militant, which is what we are on earth, to the church triumphant, which is what the believers in heaven are considered. We consider the fact that they're waiting our arrival at the finish line. And it's a line that they have crossed victoriously. It's not impossible. It is entirely possible. It's not so high that you have to reach up to heaven for it. It is within your reach. His word has given you the ability to endure. And here are those who have already accomplished it. They've crossed the finish line. They are there to cheer you across as well. So we consider them. But secondly, and more importantly, we run looking to Jesus at this race. As he is the author and perfecter of our faith, we have in this picture of perseverance kind of a connection with the Calvinistic ideal. Christ is not merely our example, although he is that in spades. He is also somehow the one responsible for perfecting that faith that he has composed within us and put together for us himself. And then verse 3 returns once again to Christ, our example, as a means of sustaining. In other words, by looking to Christ, our example, this is a way to sustain the encouragement we need for this grueling marathon. And let me quote it again, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Now, are you enduring hostility from sinners? I imagine you are. And unfortunately, some of those sinners are in churches from Christian countries, Christian congregations, may even be in your own family, in your own church at PAC, possible. And Christ also suffered the slings and the arrows of sinners who were very close to him and who were very distant from him. Now, I want to remind you that Christ did not enjoy suffering. Sometimes in the Chinese Christianity of Indonesia, I've seen people who seem to delight in deliberately making themselves suffer, but more than that, letting other people see that they're making themselves suffer, and they think that this is a kind of special holiness. I want to remind you that Christ did not enjoy suffering. It was only that he saw beyond such suffering as is truly a necessary evil. Necessary evil is an evil that you have to endure, not an optional extra, but something, if it's something that you have to go through. You know, you're standing there and they say, deny Christ, or we will strike you. Then can't get away, then we're going to be struck. And we don't have another option. Like the martyrs in Egypt who were told, deny your faith and we'll let you go, and they refused to deny their faith. It took such a strong stance, in fact, that someone visiting from another country took heart from their faith and stood with them and was martyred along with them. But we endure such things because of the joy ahead of us. Christ was looking forward to the Father's approval, and that was so important to him. It was a source of such joy. He knew what it would be like, and it was so appealing, so enticing, that he was willing to endure the slings and arrows of sinners to get to the end. My uncle used to have a pet pig. He had raised it for the 4-H club. I don't think you have that in Indonesia, but it's a club that farmers' kids belong to, and they compete with each other who can raise the best animal, the healthiest, the fattest, the most prime animal. And this pig had won one of those contests. And so it was used to being treated like a pet, used to being free to roam around. And then after the competition was over, he was back with the other pigs in the pen. And that pen was enclosed with an electric strand. And that pig wanted to get out of there and be free as he had been as a young piglet. And so he would back up to the very back of the stall and he would start running. And he was still 15 feet or so from the wire that was electrified. He would start to squeal, but he knew that he could get through. And so he squealed until he hit the wire and broke through. And then he was free again. And it was worth it to him to experience the electric shock, because he knew that beyond that shock was the freedom of the farm. And this is what we're encouraged to consider the joy on the other side of the finish line. And that will help us to endure the pain of the race. Christ crossed the finish line not merely to gain a wreath, crown, and throne, and a kingdom, I remind you, of redeemed people. Let us then consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners. Okay, that's what we're going to do now. We're going to look at the gospel, and we're going to consider a specific example of the hostility that Jesus suffered. In the gospel lesson assigned for today, let us consider Jesus as he says to his own little flock, his own little group of disciples. There they are, sitting at the table, sitting around the table. like you sit with your friends sometimes, and he says, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. What a sad moment, what a melancholy moment, what a stressful moment. You can almost feel the knot in the stomach, knowing that one of these table is going to betray him. And he shares that information. And I want to tell you, friends, that is the moment when many begin to wobble in the course of the Christian race. One thing to be tripped by an opponent. Um, it's another thing altogether to be tripped by a member of your own team, a member you love, a member for whom you have extended yourself and expended your personal resources and awakened early and stayed up late, someone for whom you prayed, and now you know that they are going to betray you. It can be shocking. It can really leave you flat-footed. We, unlike Jesus, who knew this a little bit ahead of time, we don't always know when this is coming. And when we're left stranded and exposed and embarrassed, it is not easy. If you want to put yourself in Christ's shoes, imagine that you're seated at a Chinese banquet with your closest friends. You're pulling delicacies from the same dish with your chopsticks, even, putting pieces on each other's plate as the custom is. And at the moment that you both dip in the bowl, or at the moment that you place a piece of choice food on your friend's plate, you look in his eyes and he looks in your eyes. She looks in your eyes, and you both know what none of the others yet perceive, that one of you is about to betray the other. Jesus looks at Judas at that moment and he says, what you are about to do quickly. And Satan entered Judas, and he went out, and the gospel says, and it was dark. Indeed it was, in more ways than one. Consider this Jesus. The gospel tell us, and the epistles tell us, consider this Jesus, betrayed by a disciple who was by all measures precious to him, the disciple that he had entrusted with his earthly resources, but now he is possessed by his arch enemy, Satan, gone over to the dark side, gone over to the enemy side, joined the opposition. Thus betrayed, Jesus yet persevered, and that's the point. Could the high priests or the madding crowds or Pilate or his mocking men, could they hurt Jesus as deeply as Judas did here? I don't think so. How could they? They were not close enough to hurt him that deeply. No one can hurt you like your wife or your mother, child, your good friend. But Jesus endured this. He didn't give up. He went on to the cross and he was saved, as it is written. He offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears, one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of the reverent submission that he exhibited. I hope you'll remember this whenever you're tempted to give up the race on account of betrayals. The one who has never betrayed you is waiting. He's watching the others in that crowd. He's waiting with others who have also endured the same things that you're enduring. They endured them long before you did. We had a campaign here recently, Gets Us. And It's a good slogan, regardless of its sloppy application here. But Jesus does get us. We're following in his footsteps. He's already walked that path and he understands. Let us consider him. He is the one who endured to the end and was saved. By him, with him, in him, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, let us persevere to the end, where all glory and honor is his, where that great cloud of witnesses watches and waits, and enjoys him forever and ever. And we will be in that circle one day, because we have been set apart by God. We've been granted the gift of faith. That faith has created in us hope, and not an empty hope, but hope to believe the promises of God. And this is true for us. We will persevere until the end and be saved. But it's not a sleepwalk. It's a deliberate engagement with the one who gave us our faith in the first place, the author, finisher of our faith.